Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Uchenna Andrew Afforjabe. I'm a second-year MPP student here at the University of Chicago, and I'm also a Center for Effective Government Fellow at the university as well. I'm a first-generation Nigerian American, originally from San Jose, California, but a proud product of the great state of Ohio. I'm so happy to welcome you all here today for tonight's conversation, Inside Presidential Transitions, Plans, Protocol, and Practical Jokes. This past Tuesday, we had an election. Political differences aside, I'm pleased to stand before you today to say that I voted, and I hope you did too. For tonight's conversation, we are here to discuss the importance of civic duties, more specifically, the importance of peaceful transitions and power and leadership. The transition of power for our elected officials has been a historical differentiator in our exceptionalism as Americans, but recently we had this tested. Tonight, we'll talk about this tradition with the opportunity to hear from a great panel of experts and public servants who have looked into just how delicate our democracy is and how critical peaceful transitions are for our nation. Tonight's panel features Valerie Smith Boyd, Josh Earnest, and Professor William Howe. It will be moderated by Jennifer Steinhauer, the Senior Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and former New York Times reporter. Valerie Smith Boyd is the Director of the Center for Presidential Transition. This is where she leads a nonpartisan effort to help presidential candidates and their teams lay out the groundwork for new administrations or a president's second term. Josh Earnest is the Executive Vice President of Communications and Advertising for United Airlines, and he's also a former press secretary from the Obama administration. And of course, Professor William Howe, an award-winning political scientist and current director of the Center for Effective Government here at the University of Chicago. Some quick housekeeping things before we begin. First, please silence your cell phones. Second, when it comes time for Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience. Please line up, but also remember that priority will be given to students on a first-come, first-served basis. Finally, please be sure to check out our upcoming events at the IOP, including Predicting the Geopolitical Future, Strategies to Navigate Global Uncertainty with Marco Papik, which will take place tomorrow morning, November 8th, at the IOP. Following that, the World Voted Now What, which will take place at Ida Noyes Hall on November 12th at 5:30 p.m. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Valerie Smith Boyd, Josh Earnest, Professor William Howe, and Jennifer Steinhauer.
Good music. Cute choice. Nice music choice, Emma. Hi, everybody. And hi, everybody on the live stream. Thank you all for coming out tonight to talk about this important topic of presidential transitions. I think for the layperson, when we think about transitions, we think about the things that are visible on television, like a former president being walked to his final ride on a helicopter by his successor on Inauguration Day, or a letter that's left in the desk by a predecessor to the new president, or White House tours for incoming first children, binders of secure information shared in dark conference rooms. And we think about even occasional pranks, like the time that the George W. Bush administration members discovered that their new computer keyboards were missing W's, and the fact that many departing White House employees apparently take doorknobs with them. But transitions are also incredibly complex behind-the-scenes operations that include, I think, the filling of more than 4,000 political appointments, roughly 1,200 of which require Senate confirmation. There are laws, there are norms, there are traditions, and there's all this planning that goes on long before election night, right? So we're going to go through all of that and forecast a bit about what this transition might look like based on the prior Trump transition and things that have happened in between. and how it may or may not be like other transitions throughout history. This is a great group of experts with many different perspectives, and I'm going to moderate this conversation, but all of you should feel free to jump in and follow up with each other as well, since you're all coming at this from a little different angle. But Valerie, I think it's good to start with you, if you could, and explain to us what the Presidential Transition Act is and what requires statutorily to happen, other than traditions and what we see. What's the law say you have to do to make a transition?
Sure. I first would say you gave such a great list of all the things that people find interesting about transitions when they think about it at all, but they don't think about the work that has to happen months before the election to get ready to manage the most complex organization probably in history. So one of the most interesting things to know is that for a country with a 250-year tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, there was almost nothing in law about this. There was nothing in law about it for 2/3 of our nation's history. And it wasn't until 1963 that Congress passed the Presidential Transition Act. And all it did at the time was give president-elects through the General Services Administration, which is a small agency that manages sort of administrative issues for the federal government. It offered presidents-elect a few $1 million in funding to bring on some people to help them staff those 4,000 political appointments. And then nothing much happened for 40 years. And it hasn't been until the last 20 years that the delayed transition in 2000 between Bush and Gore and 9/11 brought some attention to the transition process, where the 9/11 Commission found that the delays for President Bush in filling his national security staff, he only had 55% of his national security leaders by the time of the attack, that was a contributing factor to the lack of coordination before those events. So in the last 20 years, there have been about 5 amendments to the Presidential Transition Act, and what they have done is move the planning timeline earlier so that the GSA now provides support to both candidates before the election. It offers them office space, which feels less important in a post-COVID environment, but it also offers them a secure IT network, which is something that's very important for federal agencies after the election when they're ready to brief the new president-elect. They want to communicate that information in a secure way. So before the election, both candidates get that set up, or they're supposed to, so that they're ready to go. And then after the election, GSA provides funding, and access to federal agencies opens up to receive briefings. And for the 6 months before the election, there's a group of White House officials and groups of agency officials that meet and coordinate under the law so that they have a unified approach to the briefings. And that's probably the simplest way to explain it with the least amount of acronyms, but I could do more if you want.
Well, that's a good starting point. I want to go to each of you on this particular question, which is, given that framing that Valerie's done for us, what do you each individually, from where you sit, think is the most important component of a peaceful transition? Well, I'll start with you.
There are lots of components. I think that I would point to the need to be ready to govern on day one. It's a massive job assembling the team that's going to occupy positions of power. And you need that team in order for a variety of reasons. One, concerns about 9/11 trigger concerns that this is a precarious world we live in. And we don't have the luxury of saying we're going to have something less than a fully staffed, completely ready presidential administration on day one, given the precarity that we observe in the world. Another piece of it, too, is just that this is a huge job, governing the United States, and presidents are expected to do everything, to say the obvious. Presidents don't have the luxury of saying, it's somebody else's job down the way, come back to me later. And so this time of transition is in many ways a time of preparation, and getting people lined up, figuring out what are your top priorities, what are the strategies that you're going to deploy in order to advance those priorities. And the last thing I'll say on this is that early in a presidential term, is a precious time when you can actually get stuff done for a host of political reasons that we can unpack. But it isn't just that you want to be ready on day one because it's a good idea to be ready on day one, is that routinely presidents' biggest legislative policy accomplishments occur early on in their terms. And so they have political incentives to get things in order so that they can make the most of that honeymoon period.
And we'll get back to hearing from all of you about who was a model of that and who might have screwed that up over history, as far back as you'd like to go. Valerie, what do you think? I mean, and even maybe even if it's a single thing or perhaps a more discrete thing that you think is the key, and I know it's not one thing, but is there something that just really sticks out in your mind that's foiled transitions or is most essential to them?
So I'll pick a really obvious one, which is cooperation between the outgoing and incoming administrations. It is a very hard thing for any president, even if it's the end of their second term, to turn things over. And in modern history, we've seen second-term presidents and first-term presidents be prepared to do that, some much more successfully than others. And you also need an incoming team that is sort of willing to accept that support. The 2008 transition between Bush to Obama was a gold standard because Bush was ready, knew he was at the end of 2 terms, had 2 wars and an economic crisis going on. And President Obama's team had the same cooperative attitude of like, yes, let's confront these challenges together.
Now, as someone who's actually served in White Houses during transitions, what is, from kind of the insider's view, what did you experience as the most important component?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing that Valerie did. I think that element of cooperation is essential to the effective functioning of government. And in the example that you cited in 2008 between Bush and Obama, that was particularly important because we were in the midst of a financial crisis. There were 2 wars going on. There was a looming domestic national security threat, a threat of terrorism that the federal government was dealing with at this time, when the people who were supposed to be responsible for managing those things were also packing their boxes. And the people who were about to be responsible for those things were still trying to find out like what their email address was going to be and where the bathroom was. So that kind of seamless cooperation is really important, and it's particularly important at that moment in time. The other reason it is important is, and this goes to the transition that was quite a bit different in 2016 between Obama and Trump, is the other reason it's really valuable is it's not just information and knowledge that's being shared, it's also experience. And in the case of President Trump in 2016, he and his team, President-elect Trump at that time had no previous experience in government, and not many people on his team did. There's a story that's been reported a number of places, and I can confirm that it's true. 2 days after the election, President Trump brought his wife and 2 aides to the White House. And President-elect Trump and President Obama met in the Oval Office, just the 2 of them, for like 2.5 hours, a really long time. And I know it was a long time because I kept asking his assistant, are they still really meeting? They were. But so while they were meeting, Jared Kushner, the president-elect's son-in-law and a senior advisor to his campaign and eventually to his White House, was given a West Wing tour by one of President Obama's personal aides. They were walking around the West Wing. It was Jared's first time in the West Wing, and at one point he leaned over when they were sort of poking their head in an office, and he asked the aide who was giving him the tour, how many of these people are going to stay? And the aide looked at him and said, none of them. These were all people who signed up with President Obama. They were political appointees of President Obama. They were loyal to him. Many of them, like me, had worked in his presidential campaign. So the prospect that any of them would stick around for President Trump, to anybody that had previous experience in government, you knew that that was not really an option. But I think it underscores the amount of information and the amount of knowledge and experience that had to be transferred from one administration to another.
I mean, the thing you pointed to here too is there's the information and just the lack of personnel. He didn't have a set of people lined up to fill these positions. They didn't even know that the positions needed to be filled.
Yeah.
Which
That's right. There weren't people waiting. It was a
Right.
really small campaign apparatus that they had run, and one of the other elements of a transition that happens is not just the president and president-elect meeting. It's often it's common for the courtesy to be extended that senior appointees of the president will also meet with people who are expected to have similar roles for the Trump campaign. So I remember it was over the holidays in 2016 when President Trump announced that Sean Spicer was going to be his press secretary. So I sent Sean an email and said, Sean, love for you to come by. Happy to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to run the White House press office, which seems a little trivial compared to like the Department of Defense or the Department of Education or something else, but actually has real consequences for the way that the president is viewed and the way the president can communicate. But Sean had the same kind of thing. I invited sort of the other senior figures from the team to meet with Sean. There were 5 or 6 people from my office, and Sean and Sean's assistant sat outside the door, like returning calls for him while we had the meeting. And it really was a hindrance to President Trump and his team at the beginning of his administration. In that honeymoon period, not only were they not well prepared because they didn't have a lot of experience in terms of like running the government, they also just didn't have the man and woman power in place
And as
to
I
take on that
recall,
responsibility.
for Sean, that didn't go so well.
It didn't go great.
And I think he went bye-bye pretty soon after that. And maybe that was underlying it. He just wasn't literally prepared enough for the role.
There were a lot of obstacles that he had to overcome in that job, to put it at the risk of understating it. But one of them was that he didn't have a team around him to help manage what was a really difficult responsibility, particularly at the beginning of a presidential term, and particularly for somebody like President Trump, who had such a complicated relationship with the media, again, at the risk of understating.
So let's just use the politically science word about that transition. It was wacky. So in history, are there other examples was that the wackiest transition in our history that we know, or are there other examples that you can think of?
Some of the other really tough ones, of course, were the Civil War, where Lincoln and Buchanan had very different views, and Buchanan was not interested in investing in Lincoln's success, so very little cooperation there. States seceded from the Union at the time, just about as bad as it could get. Also the Great Depression, where Hoover and FDR had very different views of how to address the challenge, and very little investment by the outgoing president in FDR's new programs and success. So there are these major moments in U.S. history where there are different perspectives on how to handle them, and a lack of cooperation that makes things go very badly.
I seem to remember too that the Biden administration folks said that the Trump folks were not helpful in giving them, I think it was even classified briefings, wasn't it? I mean, they complained a lot that I think it was over at the DOD, or they were not getting as much cooperation as they had hoped for. Was that the case?
This raises a whole other set of questions about what we could have been facing in this transition, and fortunately we're not right now. But that is a real challenge for federal agencies, where over the last 6 months, they've been preparing proactive briefings for incoming teams. In this election, there was a new change to the law where, given following the challenges in 2020, one of the ways to address that was to open up access to federal agencies to both candidates' teams if the election outcome was unknown. So if you were EPA and you would normally provide 75 briefings to one team, they were now preparing to provide 150 and take in requests for information for more, whatever the other teams were interested in, and provide equal access to information to both teams. And that was so fraught for them to be able to do all of that work, plus their regular business. And so when you bring up that example of DOD, I think that is a famous example of something that did not go well in 2020. And I think there are many sides to the story where the career officials who are in charge of transition planning at an agency, they're reporting to the current political leaders and experiencing some pressure for that. Mm-hmm. And they're responsible to welcome the incoming team. And that is in that circumstance, that was a very difficult position to be in.
And I suppose with that example, but many others, it's not just as you point out, being able to set your agenda and start to implement your agenda, but I'm guessing that there are national security and foreign policy even implications in these transition moments. Fair to say?
Definitely fair to say. I mean, I was actually thinking today about one of the other interesting elements of the 2016 election was the decision that President Trump made. I think one of the first calls he took from a foreign leader was the leader of Taiwan. And
that was a mistake.
It raised all kinds of, in foreign policy think tanks all across Washington, D.C., heads were exploding because of what had happened. And President Trump just sort of embraced this as, first of all, as somebody who called to congratulate him, so you knew that he was going to take the call. The second thing was I think he was genuinely overzealous in terms of sort of saying, well, I'm the president-elect, I got to call this person back. The thing that it did, though, is it sent a very confusing signal to China about sort of where it ranked in our order of foreign policy priorities, and could have led to some miscalculation in our relationship with the Chinese. So there's an interest in people all around the world and leaders of other countries in what's happening here and how the transition is being conducted. And so the ability to get experienced people up to speed who have a coherent view about what our policy should be, even if it is different from the one that has been implemented by the incoming administration, is really important, because there are consequences. Returning that call did send a signal, whether it was intended or not. I suspected it wasn't, but there were consequences for that.
And was that due to, again, this issue of having a lack of the appropriate and informed personnel, political appointee to guide him on that?
I think that's probably some of it. Would that person have been able to talk President Trump out of returning the call? I don't know if they would have been able to, but I'm not sure that he got that. I mean, I don't know, but my big guess is he didn't get that advice.
But the thing that you're pointing to, which is really important, it isn't just that the job is overwhelming, it's that everybody is watching worldwide about how you're going to perform it, and making all kinds of inferences about what your priorities are, what policies are going to follow. And in that way, I think this moment is much more difficult in some ways than the 1860 or even the 1932 transitions, because the governments were much smaller then, the expectations of the government were smaller, and the United States' presence on the world globe was not what it is today. And now, from word go, if things go awry, it's this president who's going to need, the incoming president, who's going to need to attend to it, not just what's going on domestically, but all around the globe.
Yeah. The other thing that makes these transitions so complicated is that even in these, well, I guess I would say even in especially high leverage moments, even in the midst of a transition, we still do have one president at a time. Mm-hmm. So there's likely to be something that happens in the next 60 days between now and Inauguration Day when an important presidential decision needs to be made. And it's going to be made by the person who was elected more than 4 years ago, not the person who was just elected a few weeks ago. And that does make things really complicated. And there's, in the 2016 transition, again, from President Trump to President Obama, there's public reporting around a lot of mysterious phone calls between the Russian embassy in the United States and members of President Trump's transition team. Yeah. And there are all kinds of questions about, is that appropriate? And why were those, is it legal? Why were those questions, why were those calls being made? And I remember I was the White House press secretary at the time. It was one of the most fraught sort of periods of my tenure. And I recall when those reports first emerged that people said, reporters asked me on live TV, is it appropriate for members of President Trump's transition team to be calling the Russian embassy? And my answer was, it depends on what they said. And it did depend on what they said. Now, I think there's later reporting to indicate that some of the things that they said may have not been totally appropriate. But it highlights the real complication of changing these really important policies when you're changing people at the same time.
And do you think that was a very striking example? Are there historical incidents that are similar to their particular time periods to that, do you think?
Where where they're working at cross
Question
purposes.
about
Where
one
something, the one president question, something, a monumental event that occurred at the very end of a presidency, or even a sense of confusion over.
I mean, the most famous one to my mind is not one that happened during a transition, but it had to do with Nixon and the ending of the Vietnam War. And there were a set of ongoing negotiations to end the Vietnam War. And Nixon as a candidate, the argument goes, and there's evidence that suggests as much, that encouraged the North Vietnamese regime not to settle because it will work out better if you hold out. And that was an effort to affect the election because, so the argument goes, had the Vietnam War been settled in '68 before the actual election, that would have redounded to the Democratic Party's advantage. That's not a story about the transition per se, but it's another case where foreign policy is being conducted not through official channels in ways that were deeply problematic.
And that does bring to mind a different sort of thing, but the Iran hostage release, of course, too.
Yeah, that's what I was going to raise too. This is not an area of history that I remember clearly, but there clearly were questions raised about sort of who was in charge and who was calling the shots and who was conducting the negotiations in that period, too, right?
And to frame that up for our students who were probably not born then, that was obviously at the end of the Carter presidency, when we had 168 hostages, American hostages in Iran, and they waited until, it wasn't until literally the change of power, right? Until the moment the inauguration ended, right? Before those hostages were released.
Can I throw something that is a regular occurrence that creates a kind of schism during this period? We talked about the value and the importance of cooperation between an outgoing and incoming in the service of getting the incoming up to speed so that it can govern effectively, on the one hand. At the same time, there's a whole lot of evidence that shows that in that interim period, particularly when you see a transition from one party to the other, you see a huge spike in unilateral activity. This is played out across lots of administrations where they're saying, look, we now know we've got 3 months left before the bad guys are about to assume power. And so they try to lock down as many policy initiatives, particularly policy initiatives that don't align with the priority of the opposition that's about to assume power. Try to lock that down frantically in these final moments in office. And so you have two things going on simultaneously, frantically on one side, trying to get stuff done unilaterally to get things through that don't align with the incoming administration. At the same time, you have this need to cooperate, to set them up ostensibly for success. And it isn't clear that those things go together seamlessly.
Can you talk more, you alluded to this, Valerie, about the 2020 transitional presidential transition, and I know you said it was the toughest in modern history. You've talked about this previously. And I do recall during COVID, there were a lot of things that happened in Washington that we as reporters realized were going off the rails because there was no one in charge of these particular things. I think it was something people were like hanging off of the cherry blossoms in the park, and it was because there was nobody in charge of the National Park Service or something at that time. These things that seemed like minor appointments ended up being quite consequential during that strange period in Washington. But unpack that for us. Why was that so difficult, and what were the lessons learned?
So the person who was in my job in 2020 referred to that year as the good, the bad, and the ugly, where there were these legal requirements in place that were met for the first part of 2020, where according to the law, the Trump team needed to convene a White House Transition Coordinating Council, needed to have agencies appoint agency transition directors, needed to invite the incoming team in for meetings, and those things took place. Then after the election, when it became very clear that the sitting president would not accept the results, it became ugly, firings, and then of course, January 6th was a dark moment in American history. So one of the things that was very difficult in the middle was right after the election, and this is sort of nerdy for political scientists, but the General Services Administration made, at that time, the law was that they would make a determination to open up access to federal agencies. That was called ascertainment. And the GSA administrator reports to the president and therefore felt pressure not to open up access to federal agencies to President Biden's team. And that turned into a 3-week delay in what is already a very short 75, 77 days. And that was valuable time that President Biden's team was not able to talk to agencies about the issues facing them. So that is why when Congress looked at amending the Presidential Transition Act in the last few years, they said, let's take that issue off the table and say that there is no longer such a thing as ascertainment, and that opens up, if the election outcome is unknown 5 days after the election, access opens up to both candidates' teams, because the most important thing is that they get to talk to agencies and be prepared to govern. And that is a trade-off, because there was that risk that federal agencies were overwhelmed by briefings and at risk of being called into question whether they were being equally cooperative with both teams. That really could have been a difficult situation had we not had a decisive outcome.
But both opening it to both teams, isn't that also a little strange though? Because how are you going to secure? How can you give national security and classified documents to both teams when one team is not coming in?
So there's 2 agreements that are required under the law. One is a very straightforward one for GSA to offer the office space and IT support. The really important agreement is for the White House to sign an agreement with the eligible candidates that defines the terms of access to federal agencies after the election. And so what the White House Chief of Staff says when they sign that agreement is, we have one president at a time. We are granting you this access to come in as long as you protect that information. You sign non-disclosure agreements that you won't inappropriately release it, that only people with security clearances will access classified information and they'll protect it appropriately, that members of the transition team who return to the private sector after that service will not use that information for their personal gain. And one thing that is concerning right now is that even though we have a decisive outcome, that agreement has not been signed yet. So President Trump's team could have begun receiving briefings from federal agencies today and cannot until they sign that agreement that indicates that they will protect that information so that the White House will grant them that access.
This is a wild one, right?
I mean, anyone want to take a guess as to why you would not be signing agreements to access information that is necessary to your incoming president?
Yeah, this is not a story of the sitting president hoarding information and saying, I won't tell you because I don't trust you politically. This is a story of here's information to be had, and an incoming president say, I won't take the steps that are required to actually learn it.
Yeah. It's almost as if governing isn't actually a priority of the administration in some ways. They may be focused on other things right now. That happened in 2016, right? That President Trump won, and I think in a way that was genuinely surprising to him and his team. I mean, I think I was certainly very surprised. I'm not sure that I was more surprised than they were. And so they were totally unprepared. They'd been doing some of the prep work in advance, but they came around to the day after the election, even the week after the election, and the people. There were literally, I had colleagues in the Obama administration, in the Obama White House, who were responsible for literally like compiling binders of information, and it was sitting on the shelf, and there was no one to hand it to. Mm-hmm. And and there are all kinds of reasons for. There was turmoil among the personnel. Right, Chris Christie had been tasked with putting the transition team together. He'd spent months working on it. The election came. Trump, to everybody's surprise, actually wins. Then he fired Chris Christie, so there was no one in charge of the transition. It was really, really complicated. In some ways, you would think that they'd have learned from that experience, and 8 years later would be then in a better position to manage it.
They're not obligated to use the information in one way or another, the incoming administration. They can read it and say, I disagree with it through and through. To simply not even consider it is shocking.
So there's 2 other things that may be going on. One is a skepticism of the information, and sort of a lack of belief that the administrative state will be cooperative and helpful. And it's really unfortunate, because one of the strengths of our government is that we have 2 million civilian federal employees who are experts in aviation safety and health research and nuclear safety, and name the issue, that they are there to provide that expertise and continuity across administrations. But one of the things you hear on the campaign trail is a belief that these individuals are not responsive to changing priorities. So that is one thing where they might be saying, we don't need to hear from you anyway. And then the other thing that could be happening is that signing those MOUs with GSA and the White House comes with strings attached, that the GSA MOU, if you accept those services, then you have to you as a candidate have to disclose the private contributions to your transition planning, and those donations are limited to $5,000 each. And so you've heard Trump team representatives say, we don't want to be beholden to those limits. We can raise more money otherwise. And also, when you sign the MOU with the White House, there's a requirement to sign an ethics plan, that the Trump team has made an ethics plan available to the New York Times, so they have one for their transition team members. But one aspect that is required in the law is for that plan to cover conflicts of interest for the candidate during their time in office, and that is not in the plan that has been made available.
So in a sense, this was foreshadowed during the campaign. It's just, we don't think about the transition period. But this is sort of underscoring the point that you've all made, that this is, in fact, incredibly integral both to an incoming president's agenda and the political tone of it as well, post-campaign. Let's talk about the Hill a little bit, because many of these appointments, political appointments, are subject to Senate confirmation, and those have their own sets of requirements and norms. Can you talk a little bit about what those are, and are we able to tell if those are being followed yet, or is it a bit early to know?
So there's a couple of more things that have to happen. So when you're, one of the reasons, I keep backing my thought up. So I stole Josh's point about cooperation between incoming and outgoing administrations being so important. But you were also making the important point that personnel is policy. And this is why it's so important for a transition effort to start in the spring of an election year, to start going through tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of resumes to choose the right people and to vet them. And so some things that start happening after the nominating conventions are that the Department of Justice will start offering background investigations for transition team members and for high-level national security officials that would enter the government after Inauguration Day. And that's not happening right now. Another thing that can happen is the Office of Government Ethics does reviews of conflicts of interest in financial disclosures. It's not clear whether that's happening right now. And that's really a disadvantage to the candidate. You want those people vetted. You want them to make it through Senate confirmation and be ready on day one. So the interesting thing that may be happening there, despite a sense that there is planning for personnel, certainly, is if those people are not going through those review processes, then the Trump team after January 20th will be reliant on career acting officials, despite expressing skepticism of the administrative state.
Well, you could do actings, though, right? If you have a Secretary of State, for example, I'm just pulling that example out of the air, and they haven't gone through the ethics processes and the Justice Department processes, can you then name this person as an acting Secretary of State forever?
There are creative interpretations of the Vacancies Act, but there's 3 categories of people that you're supposed to choose. One is somebody who's already been Senate confirmed, and so there are likely to be few of those to choose from. One would be the sort of deputy or first assistant to that position. So most of those people would need to have financial disclosures and other things taken care of too. or it could be a GS-15, sort of like one of the highest levels of civil service, who had been serving in that agency for 3 months before the vacancy took place. So that's a career person. So the short story is 2 of those categories are political, 1 is career, and they're unlikely to have those political categories available to them.
Okay. Again, I'm looking for historical precedents because this seems like an interesting foreshadowing of how this administration is going to unroll, and it does seem curious because, again, there's been a little bit of time between 2016 and the surprise win and now. Time to prepare, time to learn from those mistakes. So what I'm hearing is I'm hearing more a picture painted of this being a feature and not a bug of this incoming administration.
I think that President-elect Trump feels like he has a mandate to shake up the system. And we're going to go through another 4 years of testing just how strong our norms and institutions and laws actually are. There's a lot of clarity around the Vacancy Act. And will a Republican majority in the Senate and a Republican majority in the House and a well-stocked judiciary with lots of conservative scholars who are politically sympathetic to President Trump, will they enforce those laws and norms or not? And I think we're going to find out. We're going to have those kinds of tests again.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is, if you're really going to take on this administrative state, I think your point really lingers, Valerie, which is if you're really going to take this on, if you're really going to stick it to it, you also need to be organized. You need to have your people lined up and ready to go, and to rely as much as they're going to have to on the very people that, not just that they've been name calling, but that they plan to take the fight to, suggests that either they're disorganized or that was the stuff of campaigning but isn't necessarily a priority in governing, or they're just not going to ultimately be able to deliver in taking the fight to this administrative state. Because they're going to need to rely upon new political appointees that go through this vetting process in order to redirect and curtail the activities of all these agencies.
Yeah. In some ways, it's almost a little like you have to play the rules of the game to a certain extent in order to get in the position to change the rules of the game. But if you're not willing to sort of get over that first hump, and the first hump, of course, is winning an election. So in many ways, they've done the hard part. Now it becomes, can you find people who are like-minded and determined enough to try to take on the fight with you, and do so in a disciplined way with that sort of clear goal in mind. In addition to taking on the responsibility to run the country, right? You don't just have an ideological agenda you're going to try to put forward here. You've also got to, manage the economy and implement regulations and sort of do the other things that are part of governing. That, again, even an impartial, fair interpretation of what President Trump did in his first term, which I'm probably not well qualified to offer, I think even that person would say that was just never the priority. That is not the style of leadership that he brought to the White House.
I think Americans are going to learn a lot about the Vacancy Act that they never knew before. Can we talk a little bit? You alluded to it earlier, and I'm intrigued about the emotional components of transitions, because you said even a president who's had the only 8 years they're allowed to have in American life, as opposed to a disposed of one-term president, still has emotions around leaving. Do you all have examples from your experiences and your scholarship and so forth of the difficulties, the challenges, even maybe funny things around these transitions and the emotions of the outgoing team and the incoming folks?
Well, I'll start. I mean, there's something that's been on my mind a lot the last couple of days, perhaps for obvious reasons. As the overwhelming emotion that I felt in 2016 after President Trump's election was shock. To be honest, it hardly crossed my mind at the time that he could potentially win, and I was obviously very wrong about that. This time around, I'm not shocked. I'm still deeply disappointed in the outcome, but not shocked. But my colleagues in the White House were shocked and deeply disappointed in 2016 as well. And the morning after remember, we sort of went late into the night. President Trump gave his speech at his rally, probably 2:30 or 3 in the morning East Coast time that night. I stayed up to watch it, knowing I was going to have to talk about it on TV the next day. So he finished speaking, I watched a little bit of the recap. I went and slept for maybe like an hour and a half, got back up and got dressed and shaved and went to the office. And what I found in the office were people all across the West Wing who were distraught. Mm-hmm. And there was like a ton of emotion in that. And it felt like a pretty dramatic repudiation of everything that that people who'd been supporting President Obama had been working on for more than 8 years, including those of us who'd worked on the campaign. As other, in our communications staff, our team was really young, particularly at that point in the presidency. And they were also much more prone to emotions. I mean, many of the sum of their political experience had been either 1 or 2 resounding Obama victories. So you can imagine how different this election night felt to them. We gathered them all together in my office at the time, and we're sort of going around the room, and some of the leaders of the team are trying to address sort of the whole communications team, knowing we've got a lot of work to do that day, let alone the next couple of months. And it's a pretty emotional meeting, and at one point, we're all sort of huddled in the office. There are probably 50 of us gathered in this office. And there's a knock at the door, and it's President Obama's assistant who poked her head in the office and looked at me and said, Josh, the president needs to see you. And so I walked out to go see him. And the president wanted to talk about his remarks that day, the remarks that he delivered in the Rose Garden. And so we're talking about that. And then he said, well, somehow it came up that I was actually meeting in my office with the whole communication staff to talk to them about the election. And he said, well, why don't you just bring them in here? And so the whole communications office came into the Oval Office. And for many of those staffers, again, almost all of them under the age of 30. And for many of them, it was their very first time in the Oval Office. And there's actually a picture that Pete Souza, President Obama's presidential photographer, took of President Obama in the Oval Office, standing in front of the Resolute desk, the communications team sort of ringing the office, many of them with tears in their eyes, hearing President Obama sort of offer his consolation to them and encouragement to them. That was very similar to the remarks that he ended up giving a few hours later in the Rose Garden to the country. But these elections are emotional. The people who are serving in government, they're not doing it because it's glamorous. They're not doing it because they get a big paycheck. They're doing it because they really care about what is happening. And when these transitions occur across party lines in particular, it does arouse a lot of emotion and does influence the way that the next few months play out.
Mm-hmm. That was beautiful. And I feel like I want to give 2 more emotional examples because I've served in a combination of political and career roles in the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, and feel like I've seen how it's emotional for political appointees and for careers. And so I was in the White House at the end of the Bush administration and saw these people who had grown up together for the last 8 years. They'd been young people on the campaign, they'd gotten married, had kids, formed homes in DC, and they're leaving and going back to Texas or Iowa and starting a new life and new jobs. And it's hard to see. And I happened to be in a position where President Obama's team was changing the office structure and kept several of us on. And the next day, the Obama team shows up, and they're young and bright and chipper and own the place. And what a strange feeling for career staff to see the enthusiasm of political leaders at the beginning when the day before you've been feeling sort of an ending. And despite falling in love with the Obama team and staying with them for 7 more years, I was like, I can't do this again. I couldn't do it again in 2016 to see that departure. So that And I think that happens across federal agencies too, where new leaders come in like throughout an administration, but very often at the beginning and leaving it at the end. And there's often a lack of trust at the beginning and a skepticism. And then as my boss, Max, always says at the end, the cabinet secretary leaves and gives a speech about how these are the best people I've ever worked with. And then the careers are sort of left not knowing who they're going to get next. Like, will they have good bosses in their office? Will they know how to manage people? Will they know the issues? And that's kind of a lot to go through over and over and over again.
See, Washingtonians are people too. We're going to begin Q&A in 2 minutes. I think we're going to have a roving microphone. And no, we have a standing microphone. So our wonderful IOP staff over here are putting that down. As per our policy, we always give priority to students. So if you have a question burning in your mind about presidential transitions or anything else for this expert panel, you can go ahead and start lining up there. Will, did you want to add to that emotional part of it?
I don't feel emotions, so I don't know what any of this talk has been about. But there is another kind of emotional regulation that I'm told about that I wonder if you guys might weigh in on, which is the transition from campaigns to the transition period. That is, for the winners, there's a kind of, these people are fired up, and those feelings need to be regulated, do they not? And the people who may have played key roles in getting somebody elected are not necessarily the people you want then during the transition period, much less in the governing period, to make hard decisions or to set the tone for how to proceed.
Yeah.
And that requires because those people were hugely important, close to the candidate, out front and center, and that from word go requires a kind of settling and
one team,
and leveling.
And now you have to cooperate with Congress and members of the other party and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's a different deal.
Yeah, I think the other way, I think it's a good observation but I would say it might a little bit differently, which is I think it's less an issue of temperament and more an issue of expertise, which is that I was in the fortunate position where I did work on President Obama's campaign in 2008 and then did join him in the White House. After the inauguration. And one of the prevailing observations that I had at the time was, who are all these people? Right? Because I had this sense, having worked on the campaign for almost 2 years, I knew the people that had been in the trenches and that had gotten President Obama elected. And then you show up in the White House, and some of those people are there, but there are also a whole bunch of other people who may or may not have been involved at all in the campaign. And it's a little like, what did you do to earn your spot here? And the thing that they did to earn their spot, though, which I came to appreciate later, is they had an expertise. Yeah. Right? They understood. They were an economic policy expert, or they knew something about domestic policy or national security that meant that they should be working at the National Economic Council or the National Security Council. They should have these positions in the White House where they're helping the president make policy, even if they didn't work on the campaign. They do share his view. But the integration of those teams is complicated, and it is emotional, right? For all of the people who work in the White House for 8 years and pour their heart on the job, the same is true of people who spent a year or two working on the campaign. And integrating those teams is a challenge. It also underscores the importance of culture. And I think that's true in any large organization. It's absolutely true, working in a White House, that establishing the right kind of culture, the way that you treat other people, the way that you make decisions, the way that you talk to your boss, the way that you talk to the people who are who think of you as the boss, all that stuff that matters, but it's all challenged by the upheaval that is part of any sort of transition.
That's super interesting. Where's our students? Where's our people? Line up. It's time. Go ahead and ask a question. Anyone? Just say your name and your affiliation with the university.
Hi, yeah. My name is Jay Almanchili. I'm an MBA student currently, and the question I had is, I'm interested in working in the incoming administration, so what steps could I potentially take to get involved?
So keep an eye out for their official resume application site. Like, I was on their websites last night looking for it because everybody's asking me this question, and I don't think it's up yet. But either America First Policy Institute or Trump for America or a transition team website, if and when they stand it up, there should be a resume bank. And just, number one, like, get your information in there and then work everybody. Like, your professors who know somebody who's going in, find the connections and get the introductions and talk to people. This is probably something you can speak to better too. You want and need to get pulled in by somebody, and it's a great time and opportunity to go do that.
And it has to be, you have to go that route, right? Even if you're getting a job, some other connection, you have to start with that resume download, right?
Yeah, they will say, are you in the system? And so, yes, you've taken care of that, get it in the system, but don't trust that somebody will pull it out of the tens or hundreds of thousands of resumes in the system. Like, then go find the connections who are working in the places that you want to work. And
You're a political appointee in more ways than one, which is you don't just have a political job, but the way that you'll get the job is through politics. So thinking about who's in your network, who are the relationships that you have, who've got connections that can help you get on the radar screen of the people who are going to be doing the hiring. Thanks.
Thank you.
So good luck.
Hi, good evening again. Uchenna, second-year MPP student here at Harris. One interesting take that I heard coming out of the election this week was that our institutions are fundamentally built in a way where elements of them require longer periods of time to fully dismantle that. And one of the bigger questions or concerns that people have is what happens when there are a lot of people working in tandem to shake it up. My question now is then, when you look at a room full of students who are younger, interested in public service, a selfless job, one that underpays in most cases, but is a true dedicated art, what would you say would be a constant theme that someone should carry for themselves over a career of considering public service? Because we're, at least for those who are kind of concerned right now, we're looking at a massive undertaking to just maintain, not even just improve, but to maintain some of the institutions that are now under threat and elements of our democracy that some may feel as though that they're terrified to even try to make a change for.
There's lots of dimensions to this, and we talked earlier about a coming assault on the administrative state. The thing that we've already heard in the course of the campaign is through public rhetoric, a denigration of people who serve in government, and an encouragement that we see them not just as misguided, but as scoundrels who are working against the public interest. And that, in my view, does real enduring damage. Because for the government to work and work well, we need people like the people in this room to see, as this gentleman is interested in doing, to see value and meaning in committing their expertise that they've acquired in the service of not their own personal profit, but in something larger. And when the rhetoric around appointments is one of skepticism and denigration, and I worry about the real damage that it does to the talent pools and where people decide to invest their labor.
Can I take your happy question about something to carry with you, which is government service is so sobering and elevating because you get to work on things that matter. Everything you do, whatever agency you're in, you're helping people, security, safety, access to services in some way, and it is you feel honored and privileged to be able to have that mission, to dedicate yourself to that mission. And I don't know anybody who has left government service who is not wistful for their time inside, because it is just such a wonderful feeling to be, it's not about you, it's about something bigger than you.
Yeah, I think the advice that I often have for young people who are interested in public service is is to work on something or for someone that you genuinely believe in. Compromising at this stage in your career, it's not worth it. It's not, I've mentioned earlier, like the people who have these jobs aren't doing it for the paycheck. They're not doing it because it's glamorous. So they're doing it because they actually believe in it. And I think if it's something that you don't actually believe in and you're hoping that it's going to lead to something else or it's going to lead to a bigger paycheck, or it's not going to be the kind of thing that you find rewarding. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have to pay your dues or work your way up. But because you're working on something that you genuinely believe in, it's going to fuel your passion to be willing to put in the time to pay your dues and to work your way up. But I think that the people that do have these rewarding careers in government are doing it because they're working for something or for someone that they genuinely believe in. And I think that's advice that applies pretty broadly.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Helen. I'm a second year from the college. I want to ask about some technicalities about transition. What will an in-party transition be like? How different will it be if you're switching political parties?
So if you're going from Biden to Trump, for example, so, when you talk to business leaders about running a company, you would never take 4,000 of your top people and have them leave at noon and try to bring in a new group, a new 4,000 people right after that. It is just an insane way to run what might be the most important organization in the world. And not to mention, we probably didn't follow the thread closely enough on your question about what's happening on the Hill. It is taking longer and longer for the people who have to be confirmed by the Senate to get through that process. So after you get through the vetting, the background investigations, and you go to the Senate, it's taking an average of 191 days for those people to get through the process. And cabinet secretaries might be 6 to 10 days, but if you're an assistant secretary at an agency, it is usually a year. And that is an insane way to run a government. So if the vice president had won, she would have had the choice of keeping on 4,000 friendly appointees, obviously having the right to make personnel decisions and shape her administration with different policy, different personnel decisions as she wanted. But she could have had the benefit of avoiding all of those delays and vacancies. So that is the most obvious difference, is that the Trump team needs to fill all of those positions, and that is a lot of work.
Thank you so much for the discussion tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'm Gifty, a fourth year at the college. And my question is, do you see in the next few years a trend of there being different changes in the political party rather than it being from one political party to the other?
It does feel like we reverse course every 4 or 8 years, right? Like we have the American people decide they want something different than what they just had. This feels like a political scientist question, though.
Yes.
We see, this is a moment right now of Republican ascension. They're likely grabbed both chambers of Congress. They've got a supermajority on the Supreme Court, and we have Trump who won and won decisively. And if you like the Republican Party, enjoy this moment, and it won't last. Routinely, there's this sense, this was talked about, the permanent Republican majorities, permanent Democratic majorities. We live in an era when our parties are highly polarized, and the majorities that they enjoy are kind of knife edge. And so a little shift, which then these electoral returns are correlated across the various races, a little shift can make a big difference. And in expectation, the Republicans aren't going to do so well in the midterms in 2 years. And whoever runs in a Democrat running 4 years from now is not going to face the kinds of headwinds that Harris faced in an era where 75% of the public thinks that we're going in the wrong direction and doesn't like Biden. It's going to be they're going to have a better chance at it. So yeah, I think in expectations, we can expect this to continue forward, this ping-ponging back and forth.
I think that's right. As Americans, we're pretty impatient, particularly in the modern era. We've got smartphones where we've got the information of the entire history of humankind in our hands, and we expect our government to get things done quickly. And because of the system of government that we have in place, it doesn't move that quickly for most things. And that leaves people impatient, and it puts people in the mood to make changes in government quite a bit. And I think that trend is likely to continue. I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other question?
Hi, I'm Samara, and I'm a third year in the college. And my question is, to what extent do you think this particular transition will set the precedent for future presidential transitions, especially with the comment about being a dictator on day one? How will that manifest itself? And in the future, do you think that that will change the way that the left and the right approach transitions?
I mean, I'll go quickly on this one, I think. I'll try, which is when you asked the question about the most important part of a presidential transition, I was tempted to say something that has nothing to do with laws, that has nothing to do with the 6 months of preparation that both sides engage in. It doesn't have anything to do with legal documents, but actually has to do with being bought in to the idea that a peaceful transition of power and a respect for the rule of law and a respect for the will of the voters is something that we just accept. And not just something that we all accept, but that the people in power accept. And so, despite the shock in 2016 about the outcome, President Obama was in the Rose Garden on the morning after the election and gave a speech in which he vowed to carry out a smooth and effective transition with his successor. And this time around, we did see President Harris call President-elect Trump and congratulate him on the win and say that publicly. We saw President Biden go out and give a speech and say that he was committed to a full and effective transition or smooth transition because of his respect for the will of the voters. And I think for a long time, we took that for granted. And I'm not happy about the outcome of the election, but if we're working really hard to try to find silver linings, the opportunity to try to reestablish that norm is something that I'm glad that we did. And we haven't seen rampant questioning about the integrity of of election officials. We haven't seen threats of violence to try to change the outcome. We haven't seen massive disinformation to try to persuade people that what actually happened on election night is a lie. Trying to reestablish that norm is something that I think is positive. I'd rather the actual election had been a different outcome and we could have worked through that other stuff. But if we're going to have the outcome that I didn't favor, then this is the way to do it. And hopefully we can be sensitized to try to reestablishing that norm again.
Wow, on that positive note, Josh, Valerie, Professor Howell, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everyone coming out and learning all about transitions tonight. And I hope we see you at another IOP event.
Okay.